All right, folks, we are going to go ahead and get started. And I am going to share my screen just to take care of a little bit of the housekeeping. And then my hope is that this will really, good to see you, Mary. My hope is that this will really be a learning community conversation about, and I'm editorializing here, but I'll throw out, I think that this topic, professional boundaries, is a really important topic. And honestly, I think it's one that doesn't get talked about as often as it needs to. So I want to thank you for being here today and for being part of a conversation about professional boundaries. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And just to remind everybody that this is a learning community conversation, and I see that many of you have already activated your cameras, and I greatly appreciate that. My hope is that we will have a vigorous conversation for the little less than 2 hours that we have together for this talk. So as we engage in that conversation, folks, as we say with every learning community topic-driven conversation we have, that words have power, and we want to be using language that is welcoming, respectful, and inclusive of everybody within our learning community today. Words do have power, and we want to put the people in our learning community, and certainly the people we supervise and serve, we want to be aware of that as we're engaging in this conversation. What we talk about together today, and again, my hope is that it will be a conversation, what we talk about may not necessarily represent, and the content that I cover may not necessarily represent the official views of our funder. The purpose of this conversation, the purpose of our time together today, is really to talk with each other about what we think, what we've experienced, what we believe, and these final two guidelines really speak to that. It's not necessary that Roberto necessarily agree with me or with Gwyneth. What I would ask is if Roberto hears something from us or anybody else that Roberto doesn't particularly agree with, that in our learning community today, we're going to give each other the respect to finish our points and to at least entertain what somebody else may say during our time together. So we don't have to agree, but we are going to hopefully offer each other respect and listen, and also to speak from the I. If Gwyneth has something that she wants to share about an experience that she's had or a belief that she has about professional boundaries, she won't be making statements like every social worker who does this or every counselor who does this. We're going to hopefully keep the focus on ourselves and make I statements. So before we sort of dive more into this particular agenda, I just want to stop sharing and just ask, can everybody agree to those guidelines as stated? And you can wave, you can nod, you can give a thumbs up, you can throw money. Mary's nodding, excellent, that's good. Okay, Colette, excellent. And some people are typing it in the chat, that's wonderful. If you don't have any money, don't worry, you don't have to throw it. Excellent. So before we go to the agenda, I'll just tell you briefly, there are some people that I may not have had, and thank you, Blendy. There are a couple of people that I have probably not had the chance of meeting before. My name is Paul Warren, and I am a social worker by training. I'm a graduate of Hunter College School of Social Work in New York City. And I'm also a research project director at the New York State Psychiatric Institute and a senior staff trainer and curriculum writer for the Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. And that does mean that there are times that I'm forced to go to Puerto Rico, St. Thomas, or St. Croix to train. I haven't been forced in a really long time, but I'm open to being forced at any moment. In fact, the best part of it is that bless you, Ruth, the first time that I was forced, I actually was forced in the month of February, which was amazing after 15 snowstorms in New York City. So it was great. It's been a long time though. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to be here with all of you to focus on professional boundaries today. I'm going to go back to my screen for a moment and just sort of lay before you the essence of the agenda, hopefully, that we will touch on today. We're going to talk about defining and maintaining professional boundaries. Also, a little bit of conversation about professionalism, what it is and why it's important, and then a bit about dual relationships. So that's the hope of what we'll touch on today. What I can assure you, though, is that today is Friday, and this learning community conversation is scheduled to conclude at 4:30. And I want to assure you that no matter where we are in this conversation, I will respect your time and we will conclude at 4:30. Okay? So that's a commitment that I make to you, and I will do my best to stay with that. So I'm going to invite everybody to engage in a little bit of an experiment here. And we have 3 screens of people attending, which is wonderful. And I can't see everybody at the same time, but I try to toggle between the screens so I make sure I see people. But this is an opportunity to participate through the chat feature, okay? So I'm going to say something, and I want you to type in the chat the first word or phrase that pops into your head, okay? There's no, oh, wonderful, Jacinta, you're here. Good to, and thanks for typing in. So, and we have about 65 people in the learning community conversation now. And if you haven't had a chance to already, folks, please go ahead and type your full name in the chat. That would be great. So what I'm going to ask everybody to do is I'm going to say a phrase. I'd like you to type the first word or phrase that comes into your mind. Type it into the chat, but don't hit send. So just type it there and wait. Don't hit enter. Okay? Wonderful. Thanks, Inez. Inez is visiting us from Washington State. That's wonderful. Wonderful. Joel Mary's here from Jamestown, New York. That's great. So I'm going to say the phrase. You're going to type in your word or your phrase, but you're not going to send it. Now, what I want to assure you is that somebody is going to send it, but I don't want you to. So try and hold back from, Kathleen's like, it could be me. No, Kathleen, you're not going to send it. It won't be you. Don't worry. All right. Is everybody ready for the phrase? Okay, excellent, good. Mary, I'm following your cue. That's excellent. Okay. Professional boundaries. So remember, you're typing it into the chat, but you're not sending it, Kathleen. You're not sending it. You're just typing the first thing that comes into your, and Beth Ann is not sending it either. Just type, yep, hands off, just typing it in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to say the phrase one more time. No, see, what did I tell you? Thank you, Gail. Hold on, everybody. Don't follow Gail's lead. I knew it would happen. It's all right, Gail. Thank you. I'm going to say it again, but don't send it yet. Professional boundaries. Okay. On the count of 3, I want everybody to send it at the same time. Don't worry, Gail, you're ahead of the game. You've already sent yours. All right. 1, 2, 3. Hit send. Perfect. Perfect, perfect, perfect. And I think almost everybody has written something into the chat. Fantastic. So boundaries are therapeutic relationship, essential, ethical, respect, home and work life distinction. Thank you, Inez. Social work profession, ethics, Self-control, professional. Perfect. Maintaining ethics, keeping distance. Thanks, Darnell. And Phyllis wrote professional. Okay, yeah. If you haven't yet sent it, leave work at work, yes. All right, now I'm scrolling up to the top. Because Gail sent restrictions first. So Gail, if you're able to unmute, yep.
Yes.
Yeah, if you're able to unmute, you notice, and I know you were first, but you notice that there are a lot of different things in the chat, yes?
Yes.
So Gail, my question to you is this, is why didn't you all write the same thing? I gave you the same phrase. I said professional boundaries. How come you didn't all write what you wrote? And Gail, just remind us, what did you send?
Restrictions.
Thank you. So why didn't everybody else follow your lead and write restrictions?
Well, everyone has their own interpretation of what boundaries are. You hear me?
Yes, yes. I really liked the particular word that you used there. And if it's okay, can I ask you a follow-up question in regard to it?
Yes.
Say a little bit more about what you mean. Everybody has their own interpretation.
Okay, so
because I agree with you, by the way, Gail. I agree with you 100%, but go ahead.
Everyone's viewpoint on what is a boundary does not, it's not it's not for everyone. Like say for instance, one person may feel like it's okay to give a client their phone number. They don't believe there's no problem with that. Right. But in my case, I believe it should be we should be restricted, and that should be we should draw the line. That should be a boundary.
Okay.
So everyone has their own viewpoint on what a boundary is and how to apply that boundary.
Okay. Okay. So Gail, I want to listen closely to what you said. You made it very clear that for you, a professional boundary would be, and I want to be specific here, a professional boundary for you is that you would not give a client your phone number.
Not my personal phone number.
Only not your personal phone number. Yep. Right. Yep. And you're also acknowledging that perhaps in another setting and for another person, that might be appropriate.
It may be.
But you know, for you and for the work that you do, that is not appropriate.
It is not appropriate.
Understood. Understood. Thank you so much, Gail. And I really appreciate your willingness to sort of be specific about what is a boundary in terms of your sense of your professional boundaries.
Yeah, and I apologize for jumping ahead.
No, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did.
I had a hard time getting online in the first place. So I was
okay.
so anyway,
so you were ready to send it.
Yeah.
Well, you know something, Gail, I'm glad you did because it gave us an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit.
That's good. That's wonderful.
Yeah. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So I noticed that a couple of other people wrote things in the chat about what Gail and I were talking about. But I'm wondering, Kathleen, could I invite you to unmute and ask you a question? And it could be we have more than one Kathleen, or Kathleen is figuring out. I mean, Kathleen F.O. Yes, so that's okay. So it would be okay if I asked you a question? So similar question that I asked Gail. Why is it that, and could you tell us what you wrote in for your first thing that popped into your head? Yeah.
I wrote line because the first thing I thought of when you said that phrase was there's a fine line.
Ah, a fine line. Okay. So Kathleen, in terms of that fine line, what does that mean to you? Because I bet you're not the only person that thinks about professional boundaries as kind of like a fine line. And some people may also think about it as a very clear, bright line. So what's your thought, Kathleen?
I agree with my colleagues in the chat, how I think our answer to your question is very dependent on like the fields that we work in, who our population, who's the population we work with, our setting, stuff like that. So I think our experiences shape our answer. And obviously like agency policies, but it's a fine line, I think, because I think it's a case by case scenario sometimes, and others it's very clear, like you said, it's a bright line.
Yep. Could I ask you one quick follow-up question? For you, Kathleen, because you said that for some it's a fine line, for some it could be, there can be things that are a bright line. What's a bright line for you? Like what is clearly a bright line for you in terms of, again, in terms of your experience, because I want to, build on what you said, your experience and your profession. So what's a bright line for you?
Sorry. I think a bright line, because I work with children, is meeting with them in social contexts that are more personable, not like a public town event, maybe like a wedding, a birthday party, stuff like that. That's done purposely.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Gabrielle Ball, you seem to agree with what Kathleen was saying. Is there anything you'd add in terms of sort of your take on why everybody didn't put the same answer? And if you could tell us, you could share with us what you wrote.
I shared limits, and yes, I agree with both Gail and Kathleen and what's in the chat for sure. I do think it's what we choose to share or not share at times, depending upon our settings, who we're working with, things like that.
Okay, so Gabrielle is really also, you're bringing up the issue of disclosure as well, because that's related to professional boundaries as well. So Gabrielle, could I ask you one follow-up question since you're still unmuted?
Yes.
So given that we all have different experiences and that we all, some of us may be in the same profession. There may be other people who are social workers. There may be other people that are peer counselors or therapists or clinicians of some sort, all that. But given that we all come from different experiences and that we maybe share professions, why was the range of what people put in the chat so wide?
I think it's a good question. And I think that's why we all have different answers, because sometimes it can be maybe a little more complicated as, what is the boundary?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. And something, if there's one thing you walk away with from this conversation today, walk away with what Gabrielle just said, that when we're talking about professional boundaries, we need to think about it from a complexity perspective, because it's always going to be complex. And yes, there are bright lines, but given our experience and given the profession and the organizational policies and procedures that Kathleen also mentioned, it's always going to be complex and has to be thought of in that way. So thank you for really kind of introducing that into the conversation. And I'm going to add another word to complex. And Gabrielle, tell me if you're okay with this. It's complex and it always needs to be thoughtful. Are you okay with that?
Yes.
And I'll just add and Alicia wrote intentional, and Rose Claire agrees the idea that it's thoughtful. Yes, that it needs to be thoughtful and intentional. And I'll throw out one other thing before I share my slides again, which is that if it starts to become automatic, where it's not thoughtful and intentional, where it's not looked at as being that there's a complexity to it, I think that you're kind of in a situation where potentially you could begin, your professional boundaries could begin to erode, because they're not being considered on sort of a situation by situation basis. So the idea that it's always thoughtful, it's always intentional, even when there are policy and procedures in place, and professional ethics and guidelines in place. And it's something that we are considering based on our own experience, the kind of work we do. Sonia, any reaction to that? Any thoughts about that?
I agree with everyone, actually. I was just sitting back thinking because as Gail and Gabrielle stated, the different fields that we work in, I happen to work with the substance abuse and mental health population. So
Okay.
restrictions go very far.
Yeah.
You know? And I use the word ethics because despite of what I may feel, I must always maintain an ethical boundary in here because our patients tend to take things to a broader view, which catches us in a hot spot. So I follow clearly by the ethical boundaries of the agency and their policy and procedure. And you know, we have patients that need help with certain things, but we also know that if we're not supplying the same thing to the whole population as one, then we need not to help that one because it's looked at a little differently.
Understood. So those guidelines are really helping you to make sure that you're kind of consistent across the board.
Must be.
Okay. Okay. You know, folks, if there's a second thing you take away from our time together, I want you to take away something very insightful that Sonia just said. She said hot spots. And the reason, and Sonia, I'm going to tell you what I think you mean by hot spots, and you correct me if I've misunderstood you, okay?
Okay.
So we do human service work. It's one person interacting with another person, or one staff person interacting with a group of people receiving services. We're human beings with various experiences. They're human beings with various experiences. And we may have particular hot spots, things that trigger us, things that would cause us to want to interact with that person in a way that we might not interact with somebody else in the same situation. And I'm not just referring to like transference and countertransference, but it's normal to have these hot spots, and professional guidelines and ethics help us to make sure that we don't cross a line and that we're able to consistently provide services. Did I understand that correctly in terms of what you meant, Sonia, by hotspots?
Absolutely.
Okay. Is there anything you would add?
I call them hotspots because, as you stated, most of my clients I've been working with for a year, 2 years. So the relationship grows.
Yep.
And they see it as something different than what it is. They actually think that you're their friends, or, you know, you're going to always be there. And that's not the case, because you have to have a balance in all aspects, for the simple fact that when we have patients, then they don't tend to be, you know, seen or looked at as they're doing something special, but they like to bring counselors and gifts and things of that nature. And when you tell them no, it hurts their feelings, because that's just who they are. You know, they're patients. They're not understanding that it's bad or whatever, but you have to actually sit down and explain to them why it's considered unacceptable. So I know for me, with all my patients, because I usually have a graduation every month, I know for me, with all my patients, whatever I give to one, I have to give it to all of them.
Okay. Okay.
Because I don't want anyone to feel left out, or feel like, you know, why I didn't get it, you know. So that's That works.
Thank you so much, Sonia.
You're welcome.
So before I show the slides again, Sonia really inspires me to want to jump into two very specific things. And Sonia, you named one of them right off the bat. And I want to open this up to anybody who is up for this. Sonia described a situation where a client or patient comes to a meeting with the worker and has a gift for them. And your policy or your ethics says we can't accept gifts from clients or patients. So what I invite somebody to do, and Sonia, you know, pay attention to what happens here with whoever volunteers to do this. But if I was the client bearing the gift and you were the worker that I was wanting to give the gift to, and you were going to set a boundary with me about it, how would you do that? What would you say to me? And Sonia, you can say it to me, but Sonia's going to be watching it as is everybody else. So I just want to open that up. And maybe some of you have been in that situation. Clearly, Sonia, you have, where clients or patients have wanted to give you something. So I'm wondering, folks, would somebody be willing to set the boundary with me as the patient bringing you a gift? Is someone willing to unmute and do that with me? And I can wait for a moment because we have about 70 people in the learning community. So I'm hopeful that somebody will be willing. Carolina, are you raising your hand?
I am. I was not sure to do it physically or virtually, but
All right, well, you did it physically and I saw it, so thank you.
sure. So this is something I had an opportunity to practice a couple of times because I worked with the Hispanic population, and
Okay.
part of the culture is bringing a gift. And so the way that I handled it, if it was,
Okay, can I pause you, Carol? Can I pause you
Yep.
for just a moment?
Sure.
So you've had this experience. Again, folks, please draw from the wisdom of our learning community. Different cultures have different beliefs and practices and experiences, and gift giving can be a part of somebody's culture. So they think they're doing the absolute right thing in the situation. And now we're under the frame of professional boundaries. So what I'm going to ask is that maybe instead of describing what you did, can you, I'm going to say, oh, Carolina, so great to see you. Here's this gift for you. And then you just talk to me as if I'm the person. Would that be okay?
Sure.
All right. And am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, it's Carolina.
Carolina. Okay. Just want to make sure.
Thank
All
you.
right. Yeah, sure. And Sonia, you're watching, right? Okay, good. And not from a judgment perspective, Carolina, just from that we're looking at, this is a scenario. Okay.
Sure.
And then I have another one that follows that I'm going to ask for a volunteer too. Carolina, so good to see you today. Thank you. I'm so excited because I have something special that I want to share with you today.
Well, it's great to see you too. What is that something special?
Well, I happen to have this little gift for you.
And what is that gift?
Well, these are some hand-stitched napkins that my mother made. And I'm so excited to give them to you to thank you for everything that you've done during our time together. And I just wanted you to know how much that means to me. So I hope that you will use these and they'll always remind you of our time together.
Well, that's really kind of you, and that seems like it has a lot of meaning attached to it, and I appreciate that.
My mom made them.
That's incredibly special, and I want you to know that we do have a policy at our agency that we can't accept gifts. So what I can do, because I know that this is part of your culture and this is meaningful, is that I would love to have them here at the agency where all of the staff could use them and enjoy them. Would that be okay with you?
Well, I mean, I really wanted them to be for you.
And I'll definitely use them and enjoy them. And, again, your mom, that's really special that she did this. And I do want you to know that I understand the meaning behind this. I do appreciate that. And, we're going to remember you. And I think that this would be really cool for, me to share the story with the staff and for everybody to understand where this came from.
Oh, okay. So you tell the whole staff about it.
Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm a little disappointed that you can't take them yourself, but if just as long as the staff knows that they were really for you and that would be the important thing.
Well, I'll definitely share where they came from, and I appreciate you respecting that I have a professional boundary I have to keep.
Huh. Well, thank you. I'm wondering though, why is it that you have that policy? I
Well,
mean, what's the harm? Like,
Sure, that's a big question, and just in a very short answer, I can say that as you being my client and me being your therapist, we have to have these boundaries so that we make sure that clients are all treated the same, and that you are also not accused of trying to bribe your way out of finishing treatment or getting any kind of special favors. That's why we have professional boundaries that we have to keep.
okay. All right. Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Great. Tell your mom thanks.
I will. A round of applause. So, Carolina, how was that with 70 plus supportive viewers on your side?
So I just got off a plane and I'm on my phone, so I can only see you. So it was pretty comfortable.
Excellent.
And that's the truth.
Fantastic. And Patricia writes, "You're a tough client, Paul!" Exclamation point. Patricia, why am I a tough client?
You didn't want to take no for an answer. I'll answer that.
Okay. So you got that, right, Carolina?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Patricia. Why was I a tough client? Did anyone else, in addition to Patricia and Carolina, think I was a tough client? Yeah, why? Why, Colette, why was I a tough client? Colette has been waiting to say this. Why you didn't accept no, Patricia says. Okay, all right. What do you think, Colette?
Well, you were pressing her boundary. So she was like explicitly stating, this is the boundary, this is the policy, and you were pressing it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And
I wouldn't necessarily go as far to say that you were a tough client though, because I really wouldn't expect the client to have the knowledge of the boundaries, because that's not really something that people outside of this profession probably put that much thought into. So I wouldn't call you a tough client, but I would say that what was difficult about that situation was that you were probably unintentionally pressing against the boundary that she was putting in place.
Okay. Colette, could I ask you just one follow-up question in regard to that?
You may.
All right, thank you. And see, I was going to respect Colette's boundary, and she said I could ask her another question. So Colette, what's your thinking behind why I pressed Carolina's boundary?
I would say you in this scenario pressed her boundary because this was an important thing to you. This was something that was very meaningful and special, as Carolina had explicitly stated. And for you, it was probably feeling like you were being rejected or you were being denied. Yes, thank you so much. Thanks. And Carolina very skillfully helped me to not feel rejected. Yeah. Sonia, any thoughts? Did you think I was a tough client?
And in a way, yes, but I also know that you actually performed exactly how a client would perform.
Yeah, and Lynn, I think, just put that in the chat too. So say a little more about that, Sonia.
As Caroline said, that we have to look at each one of our clients' culture.
Yeah.
And that's what I meant when we go to them and we say, you know, I appreciate it, but I can't accept it, or maybe we can just like share this with the group. You
Yeah.
know, we gotta think very hard on how to do that without hurting their feelings, because some of them may, you know, feel rejected or feel like, you know, why she's not going to accept it? You know, what did I do? You know,
Right.
you have to look
Right.
at that, because cultures are different. You know, they
Yep.
don't
Yep.
mean harm, but
Yep.
that's their way of appreciation. And it's hard for us as clinicians, those that work in the field, to kind of like say to them, you know, it's okay, you know, you didn't do anything wrong. It's just that we have certain policies in place and certain boundaries that we cannot cross, you know, but they don't really understand that. But what you did was you acted just like one of the clients would act.
Okay. I did my
They
best.
do.
I did my best. Okay. Okay. And before we go to Sharonda, Carolina, could I ask you a follow-up question?
Absolutely.
So I know that because you're on your phone, the other people in the learning community, that didn't add any stress to you. I'm curious though, can you say a little bit about how, when it was all said and done, how you felt after you set the boundary and after the client actually accepted it? How did you feel?
I felt good about it. And I think just because I've been in this situation before and it's
Okay.
ended up well, and it's also not ended up well, that
Mhm.
this felt good,
Mhm.
because I'm very clear with what my boundary is. And if it comes to the point where my client's gonna, you know, get upset and pout, and, you know, then that, if it comes to that, then that's unfortunate for my client. There's, you know, there's black and white ethics for me.
Mhm.
And this had a little bit of gray, but for me,
Mhm.
it's my line is my line.
Complexity.
Absolutely.
Complexity. Yes. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks. Um, Gwen says, wondering if you can speak to any precautions with using culture to explain justify client behavior. Gwen, can you unmute and say a little more about that? I'm not sure if I want to, if I and actually, Gwen, can you hold your thought for just 1 second? Because I want to make sure that I recognize Sharonda, and then we'll come right back to you. Go ahead, Sharonda, and thanks so much for your patience.
I worked in a residential program many years ago, and that was a huge problem. You're right. You know, working in residential with families, bringing things in. So I think we had to just introduce it into the policy. That was a part of the orientation. So when all the families came in, that was a part of their orientation when we talked
Okay.
about, you know, like weekend visits and things of that sort, like gift giving. Like we had to really snip it in the bud, because it would be, you know, you would have a very persistent family member or a client that just wanted to give their favorite counselor like a pin or whatever it was. And so it was not even, I can't remember if we allowed it, if it was for the group or not. I think it was just like a cut, because I think that was one of the things that it was open to if it shared for the additional staff, but the clients were very persistent that I gave Miss Sharonda a pin and I saw Miss Jennifer with the pin, and now it's a whole thing. And so I
Right.
believe we put it in a policy. I mean, I'm sorry, not a policy, but in the orientation package.
Yep. Yep.
And really kind of reinforce that with the clients, but as well as their parents. So it was to avoid that, because it got really messy. And I kind of remember it's like 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
one of the things was that, you know, I think we were allowing to accept it, and then something happened that it became like offense. Something happened and they were like, just cut it all out. Just cut it all out.
Yep.
So
And
just wanted that little tidbit.
I appreciate that tidbit, and I appreciate it especially for it became very messy.
Yeah. It became messy. It did. And I think we put in the orientation packets. Like it just got like, I think it was like a kid gave a pin or a book. It was something small.
Understood.
And they saw the other person, and it just like, it was
Yeah.
ugly. So
Blew
to
up.
avoid that, we were like, just take everything out. And that was a part of the orientation packet. When people come into treatment, that was like that they knew that handoff.
Yep. And again, that's a very creative way to sort of build the policy, not only for the staff, but also for the client community as well, by putting it sort of in like an orientation packet. But again, I want to go back to, it got very messy.
It did. It got messy.
Because oftentimes things will get messy and then they have to be looked at retrospectively. And what I'd like you to consider, and that's unavoidable in a lot of situations, because remember the complexity of things, that can be unavoidable. The thing I want you to also consider is that you can think through these things proactively or preemptively as well. So I just want to offer that perspective as well. And if something has to be addressed retrospectively, that doesn't mean you failed or you did it wrong. It means that you're being responsive to what's coming up within your community. Go ahead, Gwen, and thanks so much for your patience. Go ahead.
I don't think I really have a fully formulated question.
Okay. Right. You don't need to have a formulated question. Go ahead.
Other than there was something in and nothing against Carolina, there was something in the response where the use of culture, I would say, like, somehow rubbed me the wrong way.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you had anything to say about that. I still haven't formulated my question, so that I just wondered if you had anything to add.
I do, actually, I do. And I think I know exactly what you're referring to, because, and I'm going to tell you how it landed on me. And I'm glad that it landed on you differently. But what Carolina said to me, because she was talking to me, is she said something to the effect of, and Carolina, tell me if I get this right, that I understand that this is very important in your culture. That was the essence of what she said. I can understand that this is very important in your culture. How I took that, based on the way Carolina said it, was that she saw and appreciated that this was important to me. So that's how it landed on me as, that momentary client. Okay, that's how it landed on me. Gwen, your point's really well taken, because how that could be said to somebody could either help the person to feel seen and respected or disrespected. So it's something that I think you'd have to know the client to some degree. Again, clearly this was a client that, for the purposes of the scenario, there had been a long-standing relationship. So your point's really well taken, that simply, and I'm going to attempt to deliver it in a way that might be offensive, okay? Which if it was Gwen who was giving me the gift, I might say, well, Gwen, I know this is important to your culture, but that's just not something we do here. That could be received as like dismissal, not respectful, rude, even offensive. And that's not how what Carolina said landed on me. But I appreciate you mentioning that, Gwen, because it's an important caution to consider. This causes dual relationships and favoritism. It could very much, Janice, you're absolutely right. So Gwen, any thoughts, any reactions to that response from me?
Yeah, no, I get that. I think I was thinking like general, like explaining a certain client's behavior or actions with a generalization about how their culture is.
Yes.
And like, something that is kind of can occur in my work setting is East African couples coming together to an appointment, and potentially an assumption being made that there's a preference that the male do all the talking, and that being seen as like, oh, that's how their culture is, but not. I mean, potentially that could be a dynamic between just the two of them, and that maybe there is an element of that in the culture, but maybe that it doesn't apply. Like, So
Right.
just like culture and the individuals, I think. Again,
Yeah.
not formulating all this, but
Absolutely. And your point's well taken because, and Gwen, I'm going to say it this way and tell me if it kind of captures the spirit of what you're saying. And I want to go back to something that I think Sandra put in the chat that's very valuable to consider, is that just because someone may be Latinx doesn't mean that they like to give gifts. Because that could be a cultural assumption that you could be like laying over on. Now, if you know something about this person's culture, or if they've said to you in advance, you know, oh, when we really care about somebody, we give them a gift, then there could be a reference to it. But your point's well taken, like making the assumption that just because generically this particular stereotype may be applied, that it's going to apply to this particular person. And of course, we don't want to do that. So I wanted to read out loud something Sandra wrote in the chat. She wrote out that if it's important to your culture, could be construed as it's not important to me. And you're right, that would have everything to do with how it was said. Lynn writes, I totally understand and agree with what Gwen said. As a person of color, I am offended when people are quick to assume cultures of others. Okay, thank you, Lynn. Thanks for adding that. And Karen writes, one's culture can be respected and understood, but not referencing it in the response. Absolutely, Karen. And Patricia also writes, I like what you just said, Karen. Okay, great. So before I'm gonna preview the next issue. Gifts was one of the areas around professional boundaries. And I'm going, could you please give an example of how to handle the situation if the agency doesn't have a policy? Can you say a little, doesn't have a policy against accepting gifts such as handmade items or non-monetary gifts? Well, again, we're back to the land of complexity, because it depends on the kind of services you're providing, your particular training or profession, because you may have professional guidelines, even though the organization may not have a policy. And again, and tell me if you think this is fair, folks. And if you think this is fair, put an F in the chat. If you think it's fair is not the right word, but if you think it's an accurate way to assess, put an A in the chat. If you think it's inaccurate, type an I. But I always go back to the question, will accepting this gift, and again, this is if there are no policy and procedures, this is if my ethical guidelines is my profession. Remember, I'm a social worker. So if I didn't have that to guide me, or if I didn't have the organizational policy to guide me, the question that I would use to guide myself is, and I have to say it first, Darnell, before you can vote. The question would be, I would ask myself, the assessment question I would ask myself is, would my accepting this gift cause harm to the client or my ability to work with the client, or to the other clients that I provide services to? So that would be the guidance that I would use if I didn't have an organizational policy, if I didn't have ethical guidelines. I would have to ask myself that. And hopefully I would ask myself that, especially if I really liked what they made and I wanted it. And I think that's an important consideration, because remember, we're people too. We may really like this person. We might really like what they made for us, but is accepting it, yes, it does come, you're absolutely right. It does come back to being intentional. Does accepting it potentially risk the relationship and the effectiveness of the work? Any thought or reaction to that as a response? Perfect. Thank you. Those are great thoughts and considerations. Okay. Thankful, yeah, for the social work ethics. Me too. I agree with that. Yeah. All right. So here's the other situation, and you're not going to be surprised when I throw this out, because I think any conversation about professional boundaries is lacking if this doesn't get put on the table. And I'm going to preview it. Okay. I'm going to preview it before, and Kathleen puts a really interesting thing in the chat, and I'm going to come back to that. But I'm going to preview it, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it. But I want it to sort of lay out there. The client asks you out for a date or expresses sexual interest. So Beth Ann is like, no way. All right, I'm going to just put that on the table at this particular moment, and we're going to come back to it. Okay? Because we need to talk about how we would set a boundary in regard to, and Patricia says, are they good looking? Which is a consideration, because keep in mind, folks, Patricia, I'm so glad you said that, even though I know you're using your humor, but I'm glad you said that, because I want to normalize something, folks. Remember, I said it's one person helping another person, and I'm not asking anybody to make any kind of disclosure here, but I want you to entertain the thought that it is possible that there are people that we provide or have provided services to that we may find attractive emotionally, physically, or however. And that's a reality of one person providing services to another. And again, this is why we have professional boundaries. So we're going to come back to this, okay? But I wanted to lay it on the table because I want to make sure that we do discuss it. Yes, Patricia, the human factor, because we are human beings. And that's what makes our work so effective and important. It's one human being helping another. And it's why we have professional boundaries, because it's one person helping another. I have learned, Sonia writes, I have learned in the field that because we are human, I must always check my motives in anything. If you didn't read what Sonia just wrote and what I just read out loud, please read that. We must always check our motives. And that doesn't mean our motives are bad. It just means that that's what we may feel, or that's what our motives may be. Okay, so we're going to come back to, hey, do you want to go out on a date? Or, hey, let's have sex. We're going to come back to that. Yeah, Beth Ann is like, no way, no way. And Beth Ann, when we come back to that, can we start with you? Would that be okay? Okay, great, good, good. And Patricia says, what, no dinner? Yes, excellent. Well, you know, before I go to the slide, I just want to respond to what Patricia just said, because I think the thing we have to keep in mind, folks, is the profound damage that the crossing of professional boundaries or guidelines can have. And I'm going to start first by saying for the clients, because remember, some of the people, and a large percentage of the people that we provide services to, are people who may have a history of trauma, exploitation, sexual abuse. And that's a reality. And we don't, when providing services, we don't want to compound that. The other thing that I would say is the damage that it can cause the provider. There are people who lose their careers, who lose their families because of crossed professional boundaries. So the implications can be profoundly damaging for lots of folks. And a number of people are seconding what Kathleen wrote. And I just want to, Kathleen writes, I think it's so important to remember that sometimes our clients come to us and we help them when they're at their most vulnerable. Absolutely, Kathleen. And that's why these professional boundaries are in place, because when somebody's vulnerable, guess what? It's much yes, Monica, they're open. They're very, they're at risk for being taken advantage of. And that may not be our intention, but it doesn't mean that it still doesn't happen. So we're going to come back to that, and Beth Ann is going to start us off in that conversation. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen just to share a couple of other things with you. And what I also want to tell you is that these slides have been put together in such a way that hopefully they can be like reference points for you to use after this conversation, just to remind you of a few things. So if we don't go over all of these slides today, that's perfectly okay. They're a tool for you, okay? I just want that to be clear. What's critical about our work together today is the conversation, is what we're kind of putting out on the table and talking about today. So I'm going to go ahead and share this just to touch on a couple of other points, and then we're going to go back to what's been laid on the table. So again, this idea of defining professional boundaries. Here's a definition from the National Center on Cultural Competence, and I'll just read this out loud. Let it wash over you, okay? I think some of what we're talking about is probably, how can I put it? It's less theoretical and more practical. And that's why it's important to have this definition as well as our conversation. Integrated patterns of human behavior that includes thoughts, communications, languages, practices, beliefs, values, customs, courtesies, rituals, manners of interacting, roles, relationships, and expected behaviors of a racial, ethnic, religious, or social group. Okay, so just keeping that in mind, that all of these elements are always interacting with professional boundaries and what the clients and the participants who are seeking services, seeking care, bring to the interaction. So somebody alluded to this earlier, the difference between personal versus professional. We may have very clear personal boundaries. We also may have very open personal boundaries, and they are different than professional boundaries. There can be times when there are overlaps, and then there are times when there aren't. The most important thing to distinguish here is that you can choose your personal boundaries. When you agree to do the job that you're doing, you are taking on the professional boundaries, the professional ethics, and they take precedence over your personal boundaries when you're in the work setting. And for many of us who are licensed, even when we're not in the work setting, our professional boundaries and ethics are still at play. And somebody referred to dual relationships a while ago. And that's an important thing to consider too, in terms of personal and professional, because personally, you may think, well, I live in a small town. What's the big deal about having a client of mine supply firewood for me? They're the only game in town, because you live in a rural, small community. And again, intentional, thoughtful, complex. You have to think about that through the lens of your profession. Is there inherent potential danger or harm in having that dual relationship? Is this person also delivering your wood, but somebody that you provide therapeutic services to? So again, complex, intentional, thoughtful. So ethics, again, many of us, if you have a particular code of ethics that either is through your licensure or through your education or training, type a Y in the chat. If you don't, type a D in the chat. So Y for yes, you have an ethical code, and D for don't. Okay, so far I'm seeing Ys. And again, whether you do or you don't, it is what it is. There's no right or wrong here. And I love the fact that a colleague in our learning community brought up the idea, and Gwen, I think it was you, what if there's not a policy or a procedure in place? Actually, I don't think it was Gwen, it was somebody else. But if there's not a policy or procedure in place, and you don't have an ethical guideline that's guiding you, you still can go back to that, considering, is there the potential risk for harm or danger? So far, I've seen that just about everybody has ethical guidelines that are guiding what they're doing. The other thing I will throw out to you to consider is your familiarity with those guidelines, because you may know that your profession has them, but how familiar actually are you with them? So I just throw that out there as a consideration for all of us. And again, ethics are a code of behavior that guides our actions on and off the job. Just keeping that in mind. All right. And again, we've talked a little bit about boundaries. We've talked about the idea of the difference between personal boundaries and between professional boundaries. So keeping that in mind. And the other thing I just want to say about boundaries as well, whether they are personal or professional, is that they are often based on values and choices. So just keep that in mind, the foundation of these boundaries, values and choices. And when I think of professional boundaries, one of the values that I think of, and I'm drawing this from the medical profession, but I think it applies to many others, is the do no harm value. The goal is to do no harm. All right. So we know that boundaries serve lots of purposes. And here are a number of examples. Somebody just wrote something in the chat. Okay, Alicia agrees. Okay. And I'm glad, Alicia, thanks for writing in the chat, because you made me pause here with number 3. And I really want to throw out to you that although we want to be thoughtful and intentional about the grayness of some of this, we can also be more confident when we're clear about what our boundaries are. So boundaries can really keep and support the worker's confidence. Again, the idea of developing trusting relationships, they help us to be more professional, and they help to clarify roles. And they help to create separation from home and work. And again, some of us have ethical guidelines that do impact our time at home or in public. So just keeping that in mind too. So Beth Ann, if it's okay, we're going to go back to how about a date, let's have sex. And before we go back to that, when I first set that on the table, you seemed to have a very strong reaction, which had a physical behavior with it when you went like this. So can you say a little bit about that?
I think it's because now I'm older, but I actually, when I was right out of grad school, one of the supervisors, well, it was an EAP person, ended up getting fired because he had had a sexual relationship with a client. And I think I was telling, I work with family medicine doctor residents. And what I also realized when I first started out of grad school, I wasn't married. And I was so many patients and clients would ask me if I was married, if I was single. It was like so interesting to be put on the spot a lot. So early on, I made it very clear. It was just, you know, you never want to give the illusion or anything to cross that line ever. And just also had a colleague, a psychologist, who ended up getting into a relationship that wasn't particularly a client, but it didn't end well. And so I've just seen examples of that I've always had very clear boundaries with a lot of things, and it makes it cleaner. So I've just seen people hurt and relationships hurt, and the differential power, especially now working with family medicine doctors, of just that differential power. You need to be very clear with your patients. It hurts patients.
Yeah, absolutely. So Beth Ann, before we go into a little bit of a role play like we had the opportunity to do with Carolina, I just want to open it up. Folks, when I sort of put that particular issue on the table, did anybody else have a strong reaction, or is there anything you'd like to say about sort of that topic being put up? Monica, any thoughts, any reactions to that topic being put on the table? Monica, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, I was trying to gather my thoughts. I think what I did was,
right.
So yeah, I had a visceral response. I've had to deal with attraction as a therapist, someone being attracted to me, not for a while now that I'm older, but never quite to this degree in this particular example. But it's a hard no. And there's just, for me, there's a hard no, and can I really still work with this person? And that would need to be thought out, not something I would respond to in the moment. But yeah, we'd have to process a lot of different things. And I would want to seek some consultation to make sure I'm clear-headed.
Yep. Again, you're talking about engaging in a professional process to make sure that the client gets the best care possible.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead, Patricia. Patricia, your mouth is moving, but we can't hear you. Still can't hear you. All right. Well, hopefully you'll get it. No. I'm not a good enough lip reader yet. Sorry. Catalina, you wrote, yep, take it off the table. Can you say a little bit about that? Would you be willing to say a little bit about that? Because, okay, Patricia's computer has issues. All right. Catalina, would you feel that you could say anything about that? About why you'd kind of like to take this topic off the table?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine. Go ahead, please.
Okay. That was what you said, your initial response, and that was just my initial response. I've had to have conversations with clients about these topics before as well. Our clinic is in a men's homeless shelter.
Yeah.
And so I've had to have a lot of conversations. And initially, when earlier in the field, it was more annoying.
Yes.
And had to have a consultation about that. And so I'm more comfortable with the conversation now, and I have a better understanding of it as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, your reaction is because this is something you've experienced, and you've kind of gone through a process with trying to understand it better for yourself.
Yes.
Yeah, and I just want to link what you said to what Monica said, that sometimes around this, it's really critical to get consultation, because this is not something you want to be alone with. Okay, so I'm going to make a couple of statements. And again, if you have any reactions to these statements, please feel free to unmute, raise your hand, whatever you might want to say. But the first thing I'm going to throw out for consideration is that sometimes clients will interpret attention and respect. They will interpret that as sexual interest, or they will sexualize that. Okay, so that's something to consider. Okay, that's just their response to it. Okay. And to be honest, that's agreed many times as a result of trauma. Absolutely, Alicia. Absolutely. And perhaps other things too. Sometimes the trauma of being neglected, which is a form of trauma as well. So there's that. The other thing that I just want to normalize is that sometimes as human beings, we as workers, we may find ourselves drawn to, emotionally or physically attracted to the people that we provide services to. And again, I'm not asking anybody to disclose that, but I just want to normalize that that sometimes happens. And how we manage it is how we take care of our clients and how we take care of ourselves and our profession as well. Because sadly, like Beth Ann described, when somebody is fired in the profession or their license is revoked in the profession because of their breaking this particular guideline or other ones, it damages the profession. It damages the credibility of the profession. So I saw, Patricia, that you typed something in the chat, so I want to take a moment and take a look at it. So hold on just a second, folks. And if you could, please, read along, read what, so Patricia writes, I can share a personal story. 15 years ago, I worked at a church rectory. I did have a priest who was attracted to me and I to him. However, I told him, if you want it different between us, you can't be who you are. I made it clear. I also spoke to the pastor about it. After he went on vacation, after a few months of this, I resigned. So again, a resignation is clearly setting a boundary. I was not playing any games or being involved with his folly. I did say to him, how many other women have you done this to who weren't as strong as me? I disclosed this to the pastor, which I am glad about. Patricia, again, thank you for sharing a personal story. And, something else to take out of that is sometimes coworkers, this is an issue for coworkers, supervisors, supervisees, colleagues. So again, we're human beings, folks, and we do have professional guidelines or boundaries to help us in that particular situation. So Beth Ann, here we are at the opportunity to practice. Okay. So let me set up the scenario. Beth Ann is my individual counselor. I've been working with her for a half a year, and I really trust her, and I really like her. And I'm very happy to see her today. And we'll take it from there, and we'll see where it goes. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Hey, Beth Ann.
Hi, Paul. It's nice to see you today. Tell me what's been going on this week.
Well, it's nice to see you too. I was really looking forward to our conversation today. I've really gotten so much out of the conversations we've had over this 6-month period. And to be honest, I have to say, Beth Ann, I feel like you know me better than anybody I've ever known in my life. I really trust you.
I'm glad that you feel that you trust me. We've been working together and working on some things. I know it's important for you to build relationships. And tell me what's been working that has been working in life outside of our sessions together that's been helpful to build. I know you want some meaningful relationships in your life. When you bring this up today, what do you see that's working for you?
Yeah, and I really appreciate that you've brought up the idea of meaningful relationships, because it's something that I've been thinking about for a really long time. Well, I've been thinking about it for 6 months since you and I started to work together. And meaningful relationships are important to me, and trust is really important to me. And I'm going to take a risk here and sort of tell you that, I find that I think about you a lot, and I wonder about what you're doing. And, I was kind of hoping that maybe, since you know me so well, and I really get the sense that you like me, I was wondering what your thoughts were about, maybe us having dinner or something sometime.
Well, tell me more about why you're thinking that in what we're working together to build, some tools. Remember we talked about the last, since we've been working together, developing some tools to be able to create an intimate relationship with someone in your personal life. And I hear that it's been helpful for us to have some trust build up, which is great, but I'm wondering how that works with other relationships that you have. Is there somebody else that you've been building trust with outside of our?
Not in the same way.
Okay.
And I feel like, the trust that you and I have is very special. And I was kind of hoping that, you might be open to having dinner, and then we could sort of, move kind of from this therapy relationship to being, more, you could be more a part of my personal life.
Well, remember when we talked about at the beginning, and we do a contract and we go over things, and and our relationship is a therapeutic relationship that it doesn't.
And it has been very therapeutic for me.
Which I'm really happy, but it doesn't cross over to a personal relationship. What is, I know that might sound a little.
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that.
Okay. So, well, we've talked about it in terms of, I don't date outside of our professional relationship as a therapeutic relationship. I don't date anybody outside of this relationship as a therapist. And we had talked about
right
that.
Now you're not really dating anybody. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm sorry. That probably sounded funny, huh? How I said that. Yeah. No, I don't date clients in our relationship on the professional way. So we had talked about that in our working together, that I don't date any of the clients that I work with.
Well, how about if I'm not a client anymore? Could we date then?
I don't know if that would be the right thing for us to do, because we've been working together in a professional manner.
Have you thought about it though?
I don't know if it's more important. No. And also, I'm wondering more about us working.
Let's pause for just a second.
I know. I'm like,
no, you're fine. You're fine.
You're tough.
I love the fact that Ruth wrote in the chat, "Be firm."
I know. I was trying to be firm, but it was like, it's hard. I mean, no.
Why? No. Why? Because I was so charming?
No. I think it was just I was trying to more kind of put it on you to get to the root of what's going on in terms of, I had more importantly, it's like your goal, hopefully you've been working on, is to develop relationships, and I'm not attainable because it's a relationship that is not attainable. So you transferred your feelings on something that's not attainable, and I didn't know how to put it in terms of, I should have been firm to say no, and that's why I was going back to, at the beginning when we signed a confidential, agreement.
Yeah. No, I knew exactly what you were alluding to.
But I was like, you were strong, so I was like,
Yeah.
I was trying to be sensitive to, if I had known you a long time, it'd be like,
Yeah.
It's like I had a client who was high functioning developmentally disabled who had a crush on me, and it was more what we did was we worked together on that. He really wanted relationships, but he always went after people who were unattainable. So
which you were unattainable.
Correct. So I focused more on, we want to find you a relationship that's attainable.
Yeah.
So I was kind of trying to do that, but you were just like, it was hard.
Yeah.
So.
I knew my part well.
You did
So-
know your part well.
Yes, yes. So, and I was looking for openings. So
I know you were, and I was trying to close every opening that you were looking at.
you were.
You're trying to be nice about it.
Yeah, you know what, Beth Ann, you were really nice about it.
Too nice, probably, with other people.
Well, I don't know, but so I want to pose a question to our learning community, and I love what people are writing in the chat. But I want to pose a question, and Beth Ann, if you get a chance, look at what people wrote in the chat. But I want to pose a question to our learning community. Has Beth Ann, and this is a yes or no or unsure, okay? Because unsure is okay too, okay? Has Beth Ann set a boundary with this client yet? So Y for yes, N for no, U for unsure. Okay, so we're just going to look at the chats. Okay, not really. A lot of no's, some unsure. Jeff says unsure. Thanks, Jeff. Lynn says unsure. Esther says unsure. A lot of no's. Getting there, Caroline says, and I appreciate that could be a process. Gail says not a strong one. Okay. Heather says no. Okay. All right. Ambiguous, almost. Yes, but Robin says, I asked, when are you two going to dinner? Okay. Thank you, Patricia. I can always rely on you. I appreciate that. George says no. Inez says no. Okay. So folks, let us give Beth Ann a big round of applause. Excellent. And Dwayne says he still thinks he has a chance.
Well, no, what was interesting real quick was that,
Please,
you know,
go ahead.
it'd be a 55-minute session. Of course, and I guess if I was being more assertive, I would have said, you know what, Paul, you know, I don't date my clients, and we knew that from the beginning. I mean, I could have said that was in my mind. So I was thinking of like a therapeutic session of 55 minutes.
Understood.
But yes,
And
I would never date, period.
I know you've made that clear. Beth Ann, can I ask you one follow-up question? And then I want to
Go for it.
Then I want to open this up a little bit. You just said something to me that really sparked my curiosity, because you just said, you know, I had it in my mind to say,
yeah.
And you said, and what you articulated was, I don't ever date my clients.
I don't ever, right.
Okay. And you didn't say that.
No. And I was
so can you say a little bit about why you didn't say that?
Well, I was making the assumption from the beginning, which I didn't verbalize. What I should have said was, you know, Paul, when we started working together in our contract, it's very clear that I do not date my clients. So I'm going to go back to that and reference that, because it still stands that I do not date my clients.
Understood.
So I think I was trying to get there in the therapeutic thing.
I understand. Which again, you modeled beautifully, by the way. Yeah. So the thing I want you to consider, folks, this professional boundary, as well as others, complex, not easy to set, okay? And we have a little less than a half an hour remaining, and I want to underline something here, because there's a part 2 to this conversation, and I want to open it up to another volunteer, okay? So be thinking about if you're interested in being in part 2 of this conversation with the same client, okay? Kathleen's considering it, I can tell. So part 2 of the conversation. But before we get to part 2, let me underline, folks, that this is complex. This isn't easy. It requires practice and consideration and clarity, which sometimes doesn't come immediately. We get to it in the conversation, okay? So this is part 2 of the conversation. You've made it very clear that you do not date, that you're not going to date me. We're not going out to dinner. You've made that very clear. And Beth Ann, you articulated that when you sort of said what you would have said. We're not going to go out to dinner. And I follow that with, Well, why? So part 2 of the conversation is responding to the client about why not. Okay. So is there someone who would be willing to engage in that conversation with the particular client who hasn't practiced yet? Somebody else who might like to jump in and have that part 2 conversation. Is there someone who'd be willing to do that?
I
Go
do
ahead,
it.
Gail. Thank you so much, Gail. Thanks. So I'm going to just pick it up with, I'm going to say something, Gail, and then you can respond. Okay. Okay. Beth Ann, tell him you have a boyfriend. So yeah, and that might be too much personal information because I may want to know about where the boyfriend lives and all, you know what I mean? Who knows? I could be a stalker. So anyway, and don't misunderstand me, folks. I'm not making light of this because these boundaries, they can help save people's lives.
They can.
They absolutely can, because let's face it, if you keep a professional boundary in place, it may mean that this person gets to stay in care as opposed to them being lost to care and possibly then maybe losing their lives.
Right.
So Gail, you've made it very clear that we're not going to go out to dinner. And now I'm going to respond with, oh, okay. I mean, all right. I mean, I did agree to that. And I know that we're not going to go out to dinner, but I like you so much, Gail. And I'm just wondering, like, why won't you go out to dinner with me?
Well, first of all, we need to look at our relationship is based on in a professional manner.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it's been established. And I don't believe we should really veer off from that.
But okay, all right, but like, why? Isn't the whole point of me being in therapy with you so I can have an intimate relationship?
Not with me, no.
But why would that be bad, Gail? Why is that bad?
It goes against my professional ethics.
Okay.
And it's totally against our program policy.
Okay.
And so that's not even possible. I'm sorry, it's not going to happen.
Okay. Okay.
But you're on the right track in wanting to build a relationship of that sort. But
just not with you.
Not with me. I'm sorry. No, it can't be with me. Are we clear about that?
Yeah, I'm disappointed, but I'm clear.
Okay. All right. That's nice. I had a situation.
Go ahead. I thought you might have, Gail. Go ahead.
I've had to deal with some of these issues before, and I won't go into all of them, but I had a pastor in my church when I first came to start the church.
Yeah.
Who I was very surprised when he stepped over the boundary line and
yes.
Actually, well, I was running the daycare. I started a daycare center for the church, and got all the policies and things in line. And I was at the daycare at the closing. It was like 6 p.m. and he came in. All the children had left, and he came in, and he went on to attempt to expose himself to me. Mm. Yeah, and so first I couldn't believe my eyes, and I just turned my head away because I couldn't believe it. And then
I'm sorry that happened, Gail. Yeah.
And I turned back around, and then he was okay. He was straight then.
Yeah.
He realized that I wasn't going to give into it. It's like I just kind of somehow just let myself space out, and I turned away, and I began to talk about what needed to be done in the daycare. And I turned back around, and he was okay. But then I decided to leave that church. But it really caused my respect for him after that to really go down. I didn't really share it with anyone because his wife was a really sweet person, and but I found out through another member of the church that it happened to her as well. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's so, you know, you would expect that people in high places or even professional positions would respect boundaries. But I think when they look at the relationship, say for instance, a person that's in a professional position and a client,
Yeah.
sometimes it's the other way around with that person right there. They believe that they can take advantage of that person
Yes.
because of their position. They take
Yeah.
it for granted that
Yes.
that person will give in.
Yeah.
And
It's power.
that wasn't
Yeah.
happening with me because I have my own personal policies about ethics. Even before
Yeah.
I had kind of jobs,
Yeah.
I've had boundaries that I've set for myself.
Yeah.
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 So anyway.
And you know, Gail, thank you so much. I'm so sorry that happened to you. And it is a
Mhm.
terrible abuse of power. And
Yeah, that's what it's called.
absolutely. And you give a really wonderful example of how your personal and your professional boundaries caused you to really take good care of yourself in the situation.
Right.
Because both were kind of supporting you. He had no boundaries, but
He
you
has
had
none.
you had personal and professional.
Right. Well,
And you
and I
know,
respected him, and I just
yeah,
was surprised he would go. But
yeah.
yeah,
Very, very, very painful, very tragic.
yeah, it is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you know, Gail, you said something that I wanted to underline because I think it's a critical thing to consider, is that sometimes when, quote unquote, the person in power, and as workers, we're in power. There's no, I mean, we can't really deny that. We are in
Right.
power. Sometimes when that person, and this is where the thoughtfulness and the intentionality become critical, sometimes when that person crosses the boundary, it's as much a surprise to them as it is to the person they're crossing the boundary with. So I just throw that out there as another complexity level to consider, and that in no way excuses the behavior.
Right.
But sometimes people cross boundaries because they've stopped paying attention to the information that they're getting. Now, I'm kind of imagining, had this guy had kind of an ethical practice, he might have been aware of the fact that he was attracted to you. He may have responsibly managed that and never acted out on it and harmed you and then caused harm to the community because you left the community in order to protect yourself.
Yeah.
So just the complexity of it really, really has to be considered.
And I believe if he had any boundaries, they were totally softened or whatever, because I was told by, like I said, the other lady who called me up, and she left. She was, I don't know what happened with her, but she just led on to believe that he had crossed the boundary. She didn't go into details, but it was around the same situation.
Yep.
So I think that if he had boundaries, they were totally diminished over time.
Yes.
It wasn't the first time.
Yep, absolutely, Gail. And I'm so glad you said that because it goes back to what I said earlier about erosion.
There you go, yeah.
Because you can have professional boundaries, you can have a code of ethics, but if you don't keep it alive,
there you go, yeah.
If you don't participate in conversations like this with learning communities, if you're not thoughtful and intentional, if you don't seek consultation like our colleagues have talked about, because folks, there's nothing wrong with finding yourself attracted to somebody. It's how you professionally and responsibly manage it.
Yes, yeah.
So the irresponsibility would be not to acknowledge it. That would be irresponsible.
Right.
So folks, we have about 15 minutes remaining. in this particular conversation. And Gwen, I'm wondering if I could circle back with you for a moment, if that would be okay. Okay, so I'd like to ask you a question, if that's all right.
All right.
So given the two examples that we focused on and sort of this community conversation we've been having about professional boundaries, for you, is there any takeaway from this in terms of when this conversation is over in about 14 minutes or concluded, is there anything in particular that you're going to walk away with from this particular conversation?
Actually what you were just talking about, I was writing it down, having a regular practice of looking at like, oh, like where might my weak spots be right now? What am I struggling with, and who can I talk to about that? To like what you said, be professionally, or to deal with them professionally and responsibly.
Yeah.
I don't think I regularly like sit down and think about these things. They're maybe just like sitting in the corner and I'm like, oh, that kind of bothered me, but I'm just going to carry on with my day.
Right. And Gwen, I'm really glad that you said that. Remember Gwen's words. Yeah. Ooh, that may bother me, but I'm just going to go on with my day. Ooh, that may bother me is important information. It's important information because part of our work is about reflection on, ooh, what bothers me. So thank you so much, Gwen. Thank you. Jeff, any thoughts, any reactions, anything in particular stand out to you that could potentially be like a takeaway for you in terms of this conversation?
Yeah, I guess the main thing is just basically what you're saying. If something's catching your attention,
right,
it's for a reason. It's our clients, right? If they're having a symptom, there's a reason that it's there. So pay attention to it at least long enough to say, what is this about?
Yep.
So.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. That, and again, building on kind of what Gwen is saying, like if there's something there, pay attention at least long, and I like the fact that you put a duration in there, at least long enough to where you figure out what it's about for you or where it's going. What about you, Beth Ann? Any thought, any reaction, or any particular takeaway for you?
Well, I was talking to Dr. On. I think it's being more direct, which helps me wanted to clarify it, you know, and checking in with yourself, but not being afraid, because I always tell the doctors too, and it reminds me of we have to call it out first. And, you know, if we're clear with our boundaries, then it's going to help the patients. And I think that was what was more helpful to me to realize. You can be empathetically direct, which I loved what Gail did when on the second part.
Yeah.
Like, no, I don't do that. But she was very empathetic. She never lost her empathy.
No.
So I thought that was a reminder to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't feel rejected by Gail at all. And I knew that Gail and I would never go out and have dinner together. Yeah. Yep. And it's not easy to do both of those things at the same time. I mean, that's the art of what we do. Sandra, any thought, anything in particular stand out for you? No? No particular takeaway?
Nothing in particular. I agree with what everybody has said, and I agree that it is kind of it can be a tricky situation sometimes, just moment by moment, just depending on the circumstance. And just been kind of going through my mind when you're like, what is ethics? And just kind of how would I define it? I think it's just, for me, just walking away with a clear conscience, and my setting boundaries is just doing what I can with a clear conscience. So knowing that if you know, did I handle it right? If, you know, when like the principal you get called to the principal's office and it's like, oh crap, like all the worst things that you did that come to mind. It's when your boss calls you in, are you going in with the clear conscience, or is it like, oh shoot, I probably should do this better? So that's just kind of what's
Yeah. And when you said clear conscience, a thought that went through my mind is this idea of that you're responsible to yourself and you're able to look in the mirror and say, I handled that responsibly. Is that a fair way of thinking of clear conscience?
Oh, absolutely. Just because it's not so much what happened or it's this fault or this fault, because you're you're responsible in the end for your actions, for how you respond to something, which means that you're responsible for your choices, you're responsible for your consequences.
Yes.
Right. Because, whether they are positive or whether they're negative. So it's not we I don't know, but I work with kids and this is what we teach them. So when something good happens or bad happens, you're responsible for it based on your actions. So you have to be accountable for it. Like it was said, you're not, it's not bad if you have an attraction or if you want something, or yes, human nature, but it's about, having that self-control, work in that prefrontal cortex and whatnot.
Exactly. And Sandra, you didn't use this word, but what you really described, and I think you described it so articulately, is that that's what professionalism is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what professionalism is. Yeah. Excellent. So folks, I really appreciate having been able to be in this conversation with all of you. And I want to thank you all for the rich personal examples that you shared. And again, thank you for enriching our learning community with what you said and the practice that you engaged in. I hope that we'll get an opportunity to be in future conversations.